Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kammy Horne, and I am the CEO of Mpact. I'm really delighted to see this fantastic turnout today. And yeah, please continue to put your name and your location in the chat here. I keep looking over. I want to give shout outs. All of us want to give these shout outs, but really excited to see you here today to talk about this topic that is near and dear to the heart of Mpact, which is more housing near transit. So super, super excited to talk about this today. And I'll just give you I'm going to just give you a quick overview of some Mpact pieces here as we get started. But Mpact is a national nonprofit organization. We were founded in Portland in 1995 as Railvolution. So if any of you were wondering where Railvolution went, well, we are now Mpact and have been for a few years now. And we are focused on gathering, energizing, and informing the many cross-sector stakeholders involved with getting the most from mobility and development investments. And this webinar is part of our Mpact Voices program. So we are most well known for our national conference, founded as Railvolution and now called Mpact Transit Plus Community, to signify that transit and mobility comes in many forms, but it's still key to leverage projects with the people who will use and benefit from them at the center. And then we also have Mpact Lab, which is a place-based capacity building program. And you can learn about all of those more on our website. So this is our run a show, our welcome introduction, and then you'll hear a lot more today. You did hear from me just now that this is scheduled for an hour and 15 minutes. So without further ado, I am going to turn this over to our excellent webinar panelists today for an engaging and exciting program. Do not forget to put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can address those towards the end. So looking forward to hearing from everyone, and I will turn it over to our panel.
So why don't I go ahead and introduce myself? My name is Yonah Freemark. I'm a researcher at Urban Institute, and I'll be serving as the moderator of this panel. I'm really excited about introducing some of the amazing work that's been happening in Washington State on the TOD front. So let me go ahead and pass it to my co-panelists to introduce themselves. So Representative Reed.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Representative Julia Reed from the 36th Legislative District in Seattle, Washington. The 36 is Northwest Seattle. It encompasses areas like the Space Needle, the Ballard Locks, a bunch of other iconic parts of the city. And I was the prime sponsor of Washington's transit-oriented development bill and had the great honor of working on that bill with the Futurewise team for several years and all the way through to passage. Kate, you want to go?
Sure. My name is Kate Brunette Kreuzer. I'm the Director of External Affairs at Futurewise. We are a Washington-based land use advocacy nonprofit who have worked in the state legislature for the last several years on housing and zoning reform. And we're very grateful for our collaboration with Representative Reed on this year's TOD bill, transit-oriented development. And I'll pass it to Bryce.
Thanks. Bryce Yadon. I am the lobbyist for Futurewise. My background as a lobbyist focuses on land use, housing, and transportation, and have been working on that directly over the last 12 years or so now.
Well, thank you everybody for the introduction, and it's really great to have all these people on this webinar here today. We're going to begin with a short presentation, just giving an overview of where we stand on thinking about transit-oriented development around the country. So for that, let me begin by giving some details about what we know related to transit-oriented development nationwide. And you can actually download this presentation if you so desire from one of the links on the side of this webinar page. So let me begin by pointing out something that I'm sure most of the people on this call know, which is that TOD has key benefits for residents and for society overall. So we know that people who live near transit are much more likely to use it. What you see on this graph on the right side of this slide is that all over the country, whether you're talking about a region like the Bay Area, a city like Chicago or Seattle, or a whole state like New Jersey. If you live closer to a fixed guideway station like a rail station or a bus rapid transit station, you are much more likely to commute by transit than if you live further away. And that makes perfect sense. People want to take advantage of transit if they live near it. And in fact, we know from evidence that living near transit and living in TOD projects means less car use, especially when there's a walkable mix of destinations that are available. We also know that transit accessibility has the benefit of increasing home values and can reduce cost of living. And from our perspective, TOD benefits can come in two ways. Number one, you can add transit to existing communities. And number two, you can build dense projects near transit. So how are we doing on achieving those goals? Well, we are getting better at building near transit. That's good news. So what this graph on the right is telling us is that since the 1970s, the share of new housing units that have been built near transit stations, like rail stations or bus rapid transit stations, has been increasing over time. So that's great. On the other hand, almost 9 out of 10 new units are built further away from effective transit throughout the country. And so that means we still have a lot more work to do. And we especially have work to do given the fact that transit agencies, as many people know, are struggling with underperforming ridership after the pandemic period. So how are we going to go about making TOD more feasible throughout the country? Well, we need to think about what causes TOD to occur. And from my perspective, we need two things really to make TOD happen. So on the one hand, we need an adequate real estate market to be there. And that means you need expected rents or home values to be high enough in new projects to actually cover the cost of construction or renovation in areas near transit. Or you need adequate public subsidies to cover the gap, especially if you're talking about affordable housing. At the same time, we need an appropriate regulatory environment, things like land use rules for zoning, building codes, et cetera, that enable the completion of projects near transit. So what you can see here on the right on this slide is that zoning and housing construction are very important, but they're much more important and much more relevant when you have a housing market that's strong enough. So in areas with a very weak housing market, which is shown in blue here, you can increase allowed zoning as much as you like, but if you don't have the market available, you're not going to get very much construction. So that's worth keeping in mind. So states are thinking about all these issues, and we're going to highlight today the work that's being done in Washington state. But all over the country, states are passing legislation that addresses both the market and those regulatory barriers to TOD. So there have been hundreds of bills introduced in recent years by members of both parties. And this legislation is typically designed to supplement or sometimes even supersede local efforts, which is to say, if local governments are using exclusionary tactics to get in the way of new TOD, some states are saying that's not acceptable. We need to pass legislation to help make sure you can get TOD built in your areas. So these laws address a whole variety of themes. A lot of them are focused on encouraging higher densities, such as through upzonings, allowances through missing middle housing. Others are specifically funding affordable housing through things like property tax reductions. Others are offering infrastructure grants to individual municipalities to improve the neighborhoods around those transit stations. And some are also reducing parking requirements for projects. So this year in the Washington State Assembly, we were able to see some really exciting progress on these efforts. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. So there was a major law that was passed by the Washington State Legislature called HB 1491. And we're fortunate here today to have Representative Julia Reed, who was the key sponsor of that legislation. And so let's begin by having Representative Reed come and give us an overview of what was in that law.
Yeah, so I'm happy to be here. The Transit Development Bill in Washington State went through kind of many years of work, mostly by our community organizers, the incredible group at Futurewise, and I'll let them talk about like that process. I can share with you kind of what ended up in our final bill, which was very much a kind of collaboration bill, trying to think about all of the different stakeholders within the housing and zoning conversation, both cities, neighborhoods, counties, groups, affordable housing advocates, folks that builders and developers, and trying to come up with a solution that would increase the amount of housing available around transit, and also ensure that people of all incomes can be part of the transit utopia that we are hoping to build within our state. So those were kind of two guiding lights as we sort of shaped the content of what became the final bill. So the basic concept of the bill in Washington, which is House Bill 1491, is that in areas that are considered transit zones, which we defined for this bill as any area within a half-mile of rail or light rail and a quarter-mile of bus rapid transit stops, cities must permit an extended, what's called a floor area ratio, a FAR. So some legislation, they use dwelling units per acre. Some legislations just use floor. Ours uses FAR as a measure of density. And a FAR basically is a ratio of how much land you have available to build on and how tall the building is. So if you have a one-story building that covers the entirety of a plot of land, that's an FAR of 1. If you have a two-story building, a one-story building that covers half of the land, that's an FAR of 2. And so you kind of can see you go up and up and up from there. So under our legislation, we require that cities allow an FAR of at least, hang on, I just want to make sure I have the right number. Yes, at least 3.5 within a rail station area and at least 2.5 within a bus station area. And again, that's bus rapid transit, which is a specific type of bus. It's a very frequent bus. It's a bus that has some permanent features to its stops. Oftentimes it has dedicated laneway, off bus fare payments. You pay your fare at the bus stop. So that's what we're talking about within bus areas. We did originally include all bus stations, but that ended up being a little too expansive for what we were able to kind of get across. And in Washington state, most of the cities don't operate their own bus services. Bus services are operated by a separate transit agency. So there was a lot of sturm and drang about we don't control where the bus stops are. What if they get moved? Yada, yada. So we ended up going with bus rapid transit for this bill because we wanted to ensure we were talking about bus stations that were pretty fixed and unlikely to move. So that's kind of the core component of this bill, is that within a half-mile of rail or light rail, you must allow an FAR of 3.5, or within a quarter-mile of bus stations, you must allow an FAR of 2.5. There are also a lot of pieces of this bill intended to offer some flexibility. So it doesn't have to be a half-mile perfect circle. It also has to be a half-mile walking distance. So if a half-mile of the light rail station, for example, includes the freeway and then some more neighborhood, that neighborhood on the other side of the freeway, if there's not a reasonable way to walk to the light rail station, is exempted. We also created bonuses in the bill for 3-bedroom units and also for buildings that are 100% affordable. And the affordability is probably the other big feature of this bill. So this bill requires upzoning in areas close to transit. It also requires that in areas that are newly upzoned by the bill, that 10% of the units be affordable to families making 60% of the area median income or less, or 20% of the units be affordable to families making 80% of the area median income or less. This obviously does add somewhat to the cost of construction. So in order to offset that, the bill also grants developers a 20-year multifamily tax exemption. The typical length of the MFTE, the multifamily tax exemption in Washington right now, is 12 years. So it's an extended period in which they don't have to pay property taxes. The bill also grants a reduction in impact fees for TOD development. That was something that was added in the Senate. And the bill does require that there are no parking minimums. So not that there's no parking, but that there's no parking minimums allowed within TOD zones. That part of the bill actually kind of got superseded because we did pass a bill last year eliminating parking minimums statewide. But we didn't know we were going to pass that when we started this bill, so we put that in. So that's kind of the concept of this bill, is that there's density requirements. There are requirements to ensure affordability, but there are also incentives to developers for participating in that schema. So everybody gives a little and everybody gets a lot under this. One of the Futurewise early assessments was that we're talking about billions of square feet. Did we say billions? Maybe millions? Bryce is giving me a look. Billions of square feet sounded really big. But anyway, there's a lot of square feet, square footage of development capacity that's unlocked by this bill. And not just for housing either. I should say this bill is for housing and mixed use development. So that means that that's more space for childcare centers, grocery stores, neighborhood cafes, as well as more space for housing. And I think particularly on the east side of Seattle and our east side suburbs where we have a large tech community, it's not just for this new housing that we can unlock. It's not just for tech workers. It's for people who drive the buses. It's for people who run the childcare centers, who teach in the schools, who are providing security and event services at these locations. They would deserve to live near where they work too. So those are the elements of the main elements of the bill. I'm happy to kind of talk through some of the more specific questions as we go, but I'll kind of pause there.
Great, thank you, Representative Reed. I think what's been really exciting about watching the progress in Washington State has been this momentum over the years. It's gone from, just simple discussions to actually getting this legislation passed. And it's a major piece of legislation over the last year. And from that perspective, we have two folks from Futurewise, Kate and Bryce, who are here to talk us through how this bill got passed and their engagement in it. So I was thinking you all can come on in and talk a little bit about what happened to get this bill going.
Thank you, Yonah. I'll kick us off, and then Bryce and I will tag team and bring Rep. Reed in to answer questions as needed. I did double check while you were speaking, Rep. Reed, and I do want to flag for folks on the call that, yeah, the analysis we did on this bill in 2024 showed that it would unlock almost 2 billion square feet of
Okay, good. I was right.
The B was the correct letter there, which is pretty.
I was
like, well, welcome everybody. My name is Kate Brunette Kreuzer. I'm the Director of External Affairs at Futurewise, and I work on our state legislative team. And so I'll be kicking us off with a little bit of context about kind of the way housing policy has gone in Washington. Bryce is going to kind of do a deeper dive into the policy development on this particular bill in the legislative context, and then we're going to wrap with a little bit of talk about the kind of organizing and advocacy strategy to get the bill over the finish line. So I know we have folks kind of calling in from all over the country. You might know, but if you don't, I'll tell you, 2025 marked our 4th year of really ambitious efforts to reform housing policy here in Washington. We here in Washington are facing a deficit of 1 million homes over the next 20 years. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in a lot of different avenues to bring those homes online so that we can address our housing shortage, make sure more people can find homes that they can afford. So that work, Futurewise started with our partners in 2021 with the passage of HB 1220. That was legislation that set new standards for how we do local housing planning, and that helps kind of set the stage for the TOD bill. In particular, that legislation requires that local cities and counties are doing housing plans that demonstrate they have zoned capacity for every income level in that jurisdiction. So that was an important groundwork to lay for building local support and kind of buy-in for the need for more multifamily housing. Then in 2023, we had a big victory with passing HB 1110, which legalized middle housing around the state and also included a density bonus for middle housing near transit. And then the other bill that passed this year was, a bit more of a climate bill, but also has a really important intersection with the TOD bill. And that was HB 1181, and that added a climate planning element to our State Growth Management Act. And in particular, that legislation requires that our biggest counties reduce their GHG, their greenhouse gas emissions from transportation through demonstrating that they are reducing vehicle miles traveled. And so that is legislation that also laid the groundwork for TID by kind of setting up this additional state framework to say, Yonah kicked us off with a lot of benefits about, what does transit-oriented development offer our communities? And one of the biggest things it offers us is reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So passing that climate bill 2 years ago also helped lay the groundwork for this legislation. I think important context to note, and again, we have folks calling in from all over the country, so far, housing policy has been a winning issue in Washington state. A lot of these bills pass with a lot of support. Many of these bills are passing with bipartisan support. Compared to some other places in the country, it's a pretty popular issue across stakeholders. And so the people, Futurewise is leading some of this work as a land use organization, but we have support from the nonprofit housing sector, from the for-profit housing sector. We're seeing support from labor unions. We're seeing support from environmental groups. We're seeing support from the business community. And those people don't all agree on all of the bits and pieces all at the same time, but there is a general sense that everyone's kind of mostly swimming in the same direction here in Washington state, which I think is helping a lot get these bills across the finish line. So, particularly for the transit-oriented development bill, we worked closely with NAIOP and the master builders and the realtors who are representing the development community. We worked closely with longtime environmental partners like Washington Conservation Action and the Sierra Club, as well as our labor partners, particularly the SEIU State Council. We had housing partners, like organizations that represent nonprofit and for-profit housing developers and Habitat for Humanity, as well as supporting kind of related efforts like the Washington State Black Home Initiative. And then, of course, always an important stakeholder is the Association of Washington Cities, who have lots to say about what the state can do or cannot do to influence local zoning policy. And, we're lucky that we've got a long-running relationship with that group. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to Bryce to kind of give us a little bit more about the details about how we developed the specific policy on this legislation.
Thanks, Kate. And I think one thing I did want to highlight, especially when we think about the history of the work gone into to get to House Bill 1491, there was 2 years before that we passed voluntary bills that a lot of people didn't take advantage of. And I only highlight that to show that a lot of the work that us and the legislative branches have done is kind of build up over 5 to 7 years of a lot of work, and that's going to be very important when you're passing these big reforms. I also want to say that a lot of the policy development is down to a lot of work that Representative Reed did during the interim. I will say that from the start, there was a lot of large stakeholder meetings where we kind of tried to identify what the main issues were and get them kind of segmented to have smaller meetings to address each topic. How much affordability obviously was a huge requirement. As we see, Johan did mention that, a lot of the work on TOD is to open up areas that have been redlined, that have historically not allowed development opportunity, these very high income neighborhoods that have limited development opportunities. That was one of the core tenets in the development of this policy that Rep. Reed, myself, and others really wanted to highlight as we worked through that process. I will say that, going into the 2025 session, the Democrats had a new governor for the first time in 12 years. We were operating slightly differently. The Ds had picked up a couple of additional seats here and there, nothing significant, but they had strong control. But I will say that one of the key components that Rep. Reed did and myself is continuously try and work with the Republicans to get them on board. I think one of the biggest things that we have is that development is for everybody. We can get housing in everybody's neighborhood if we do it correctly, and it's going to benefit everybody from for-profit developers to nonprofit developers. So again, those are kind of the things. But at the end of the day, a lot of what the policy development was worked through was, what can we do to get a majority of the Democrats in both chambers to agree to? So that's where Rep. Reed talks about the affordability requirements, but then what we like to say is kind of like on the back end, trying to assist the payment of those through the multifamily tax exemption, through property tax breaks for 20 years. And that was something that, you know, we had dabbled with early in the process in 23 and 24 and couldn't really come to anything on. And then I would say that, you know, Rep. Reed and a couple of our partners really dug in on that. And we came up with the idea that she mentioned, which I think is really what clicked the rest of the bill into line, which is that, you know, 10% at 60% AMI or 20% at 80% AMI for those 20 years. And I think that's really what got this policy there. We can continue to play with the floor area ratios, and I'm sure over the years we're going to have to keep looking at what we're doing and how we can create less flexibility or more. But I think unlocking that message where we're getting something, and I think her quote was, "You give a little, I give a little, we all get a lot," was really great. And it's something I'm going to have to use. I'm going to have to write it down again. So I want to just say that, like, in terms of policy development, what we try to do is break it out in kind of different areas. What could cities live with FAR? What could developers live with in terms of affordability and what we need to get out of it? And we really tackled those on an individual basis. But again, I think the big thing I want to say is that Rep. Reed spent an entire summer individually meeting with specific cities that were the loudest during session to get this done, to address their concerns. And sometimes it was as simple as rewording something because we all had the same agreement on what it meant. We were just confused on how we were writing it. And that was astounding. So as you work through these processes, get yourself somebody that's willing to spend 6 months talking to individual cities to make something happen. And I will never, ever forget that that's what she did.
Oh my gosh. We did it together. But yes,
did,
it's a lot of meetings.
I want to say that. And then, you know, one other thing I want to mention before I kind of talk a little bit more about the legislative context is, you know, again, Kate mentioned House Bill 1220, but from a Futurewise perspective, as the people that enforce what our Growth Management Act is how we plan for housing, how we protect the environment, how we do all of these amazing things that we think are needed in Washington, was House Bill 1220 and the rewriting of how local jurisdictions have to plan. We wrote that to address affordability, equity, and transportation. And that was really the key component of that. And one of the things that Futurewise wanted to do is say, you have these big ambitious requirements now, and you're going to get appealed and you're going to lose state dollars if you do not have the tools. And we basically set this tool and said, if you do this, you're 2/3 of the way done with one of your plans anyway, so just do it. And that was kind of the thought process from a Futurewise perspective. The other thing I want to talk about, just in the context of the 2025 legislative session, you heard me talk about a new governor. You heard me talk about all the new legislators. We had new committee chairs. We had people that were doing a lot of this. But again, the groundwork was laid from starting in 2019, where we passed our first option bill for density and cities didn't take it. So I think, you know, the individual 2025 context was important because we had people who understood the housing crisis. We had people who were renters that understood the housing crisis. You had people coming in that were afraid that they might not ever own a home as legislators. And that's a big issue. And I also think that, you know, when we look at it, we had revenue on the table. We knew that the federal government was going to start having impacts at the local level for affordable housing funding. And a lot of that was taken into account when we were running these bills. So we kind of took everything. So I just want to say that. And at the end of the day, you know, between the policy development and all the stakeholdering and, you know, working on it for 5 years was something that got us there. And again, I can never underestimate the amount of work that Rep. Reed did to get these individual cities. I will say that very rarely do you get an entire association kind of say, well, the individual cities now have to negotiate because there's so many differences of opinions. And that really took the biggest opposition away, because individual legislators didn't know how to respond unless they were getting told and doing all of this extra work to talk to their cities. So yeah, anyway, that's kind of the policy development and what we were facing in 2025.
Yeah, and I think that piece that Bryce just mentioned about kind of trying to break apart or like pick apart the kind of city opposition, oftentimes in Washington state, in the legislature, people will say, oh, well, the cities don't like this or the counties don't like this. And that usually means the Association of Washington Cities and the Washington State Association of Counties, which are associations that represent cities, but they represent all kinds of cities, from tiny little towns to Seattle, to like big cities like Seattle. And one of the things we really had to focus on for the Transit Development Bill was that not all of the cities in Washington state even have transit systems that are relevant to this bill. It only applies to areas with light rail, bus rapid transit, and heavy rail stops. And so that's really the Central Puget Sound corridor, Spokane, Vancouver, and I think in the future Bellingham. And so part of it was like really trying to sit down with the AWC, the Association of Washington Cities, and their member cities and get into the details about, like, when you say the cities don't want this, like, which cities are you talking about and what specifically do they not want? And really trying to work individually with each city to understand their opposition and try to understand, like, okay, where can we accommodate this? And where do we just have to be like, sorry, you know, everyone's giving a little in this bill and that's your little that you're giving. And also getting to working with cities outside of Seattle that are doing TOD, that were sort of ahead in TOD, and being able to use their examples. Because as a Seattle legislator, when you go to talk to other legislators, they're like, oh yeah, well, like TOD, whatever, like maybe that's fine for you commies in Seattle, but I live in a real town and we have real problems. And so being able to show them, like, Shoreline's doing this, Bothel's doing this, Bellevue, Spokane, Vancouver, like starting to like build that base of cities that are involved. And in fact, I would say City of Seattle is being left behind by a lot of other cities in our state when it comes to housing policy. And so it was really great to be able to like tap into those other cities and be able to say, like, hey, this city's doing this, that city's doing that. And be able to kind of show those differences. But yeah, really listen. Yeah, shout out Bothell. Really listening and really spending the time to understand their concerns and really trying to be flexible and outcomes oriented. Like, we wanted more housing near transit, and how we got there, we could be flexible about that.
Thanks, Rep. Reed. The final piece I want to touch on, and then I think we'll kick it back to Yonah. I answered a question in the chat about, someone from Minnesota saying, oh my gosh, we're facing so much opposition. How do we get this across the finish line? So I think, Rep. Reed and Bryce talked a lot about, a couple pieces of that. So, doing the option legislation earlier so that we could show, like, hey, we made it optional, but nobody actually took advantage of the incentives, and so we're not getting the outcomes we want. Kind of the divide and conquer strategy within the cities. And I think one thing Rep. Reed kind of touched on, but I think important to highlight for folks, around the country, there were both cities, like Rep. Reed said, who were kind of ahead of the curve and could really be models for other parts of the state. There were also cities that their city leadership maybe would be really interested in passing policy like this, but they knew they would have a tough political fight in the local jurisdiction. So they would love to kind of have the cover of a state policy to say, oh, well, it's out of my hands. There's a state standard. So trying to find out where those folks are. But the last piece I wanted to focus on, and this is really core to Futurewise's advocacy strategy, and hopefully could be a learning opportunity for organizations around the country who are working on similar policy, is our advocacy strategy is really anchored by what we call an inside-outside organizing strategy. So what Bryce and Rep. Reed were just discussing was what we would kind of refer to as the inside lane. So that's the policy development. That's a lot of the like stakeholder engagement. That's like Rep. Reed said and Bryce said, how can we get creative with the policy and creative with the bill language to make sure we're meeting people's concerns while getting to the outcome that we want? And that's what we would all kind of refer to as our inside lane. And, in Washington State, our capital is in Olympia. So the inside lane is kind of everything that's happening, in Olympia. But all of that work is complemented by what we would call an outside organizing strategy, which is what I oversee and our state organizer, Marcella Buser, oversees. And that is the work of talking to regular people, voters in different legislative districts about this issue and making sure that they know this is a bill that's on the table, that they're excited about the legislation, and that their legislators are hearing from them, hearing directly from their constituents about how they want to see that happen for their communities. So Hillary, if you could throw up our slide, I can show a little bit about our legislative engagement. This is our 2025 agenda, and this includes a suite of bills we worked on in addition to transit-oriented development. But we activated people in almost every single legislative district in the state. Rep. Reed, you can fact check me. Are there 49 ledge districts?
There are 49
We were
legislative
too short this year. We've had years where we've hit every single one. We were too short this year.
Okay. They don't all have TOD.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We'll leave those ones out. But we activated, almost 1,400 volunteers. We sent over 16,000 emails to legislators. We did in-person lobbying meetings, and all of this is really important because it both, as Rep. Reed is mentioning, when legislators are hearing from a lot of different stakeholders and they're hearing from maybe cities in their district saying, oh, I don't know if we can support this. It's so important that legislators are also hearing from their constituents, the people who are going to be responsible for voting for them in the next election, to say, we do want this and you have our support as your constituents. And we want you to show leadership on this. And that kind of outside organizing can open up some more space for the inside policy development, because just kind of a basic power analysis, if the people don't feel like they have to give you anything, you don't really have a lot of leverage. But when you have thousands of people who are activated speaking to their legislators asking for transit-oriented development, you're building that power for your legislators to say, no, we really need to go, this needs to happen this year, we need to work on it. So we just always want to flag that for all of our partners around the country as you're thinking about what your organizing strategy looks like. Having that on the ground support can be so crucial for giving legislators backup, and hopefully, even for Rep. Reed, just giving you a bit of a pep talk when you're like,
oh yeah, there were
really
definitely,
is it worth going another round on this negotiation?
there were some dark nights of the soul in there, and Bryce and Kate and the Futurewise team and the incredible advocates, really helped pep me up as a part of your constituency is also your prime sponsor, and making sure that they have the gravel in their guts to go another round on this. So I really appreciate, could not have done this without the Futurewise team and the leadership of the incredible organizers. And what kept me at the table was I was like, I committed to all these people that I would help get this over the finish line. And I wanted to be true to my word to the community and all the volunteers who had put so much time and effort into this. So just huge thanks to you guys. Big testament to your work.
Well, and thank you very much, Rep. Reed, for your leadership and for doing that extra round, even when you weren't sure, it was going to take you anywhere. Bryce, I don't know if there's anything else you want to touch on before we kick it back to Yonah.
I think the only thing I'll say, and then we'll kick it back, is that as somebody who does spend 12 hours a day in the Capitol, or 8 to 12 hours a day in the Capitol, having 15-minute meeting after 15-minute meeting representing multiple clients, I can say that having an outside game that's consistently and at key points reaching out to legislators from their own area is a key component of this. We have been lobbying for years and years and years for a whole host of changes. And when we were able to build up our outside and our advocacy and our outreach teams, we've seen a significant increase in our success rate, because it's one thing for me to go in and explain a bill and explain what the downfalls are and everything else. But when I can do that and then say, I do know that you've received 200 emails from 200 other people who say they can't afford housing, they're one day away from losing their rent or something like that, it makes it a lot stronger. So I will say that my job has been increasingly easier being able to get meetings and walk into offices, because it's not just an organization that is statewide and doing what I think is incredible work. It is backed by people in almost every single district, Republican, Democrat, Independent, and it is fascinating to have that on your back. So just want to put out that that's a key component. So.
Well, thank you. I think Yonah, we'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, well, it's been great to hear the responses so far, and I just want to encourage everybody who's in the room to feel free to click that Q&A button at the bottom and add your questions to the many that are already here. I also will recommend that there's a resource button here, and you can check out some details about the law, HB 1491, and also a report that we recently produced at the Urban Institute. And so I'll try to actually summarize some of the questions that I'm starting to see. That some of the answers are already being populated there, but I think some of them deserve further discussion. And I'd like to begin by asking you all about this question of the associations of local cities. We at the Urban Institute, we just did a report looking at the passage of state land use legislation around the country, and one of the things we found was that these, state leagues of cities were often the biggest opponents to state land use laws like HB 1491. And there's some good reasons for that. Folks at the local level absolutely feel that they are the best apt to decide how planning in their city should work. And they're concerned about the state government coming in and saying, this is what you should do. And, from my perspective, I'm interested in hearing more from you all about how you address that concern. And, even if the League of Cities isn't necessarily going to turn around and support the bill, how do you get city councilors, city staff, and others to feel comfortable with the changes that are coming online with legislation like this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it has been really challenging. And I think, again, like for me, a lot of the work with Association Washington Cities has been really to break down, like, again, what are the specific cities and what are their specific concerns? Because, of course, they're always going to be concerned about state preemption. That's just like a baseline thing that's why associations like the Association of Washington Cities exist, is to fight state preemption. But also, these associations are like associations of volunteers who or elected city council members who are often themselves like just kind of one step up from volunteering. Not only like a few cities can afford to pay full-time council members. And those associations also, the positions they take are governed by, they usually have political action boards that make recommendations to the broader membership about what they're going to support or not support. And one of the things I kind of cottoned on to was I was like, oh, the lobbying, like the political action group for this association is made up of like the grumpiest, most conservative, most like reactionary cities in the association. So part of it was just realizing like, okay, let's not be too stressed about that. Let's really focus on the cities that are impacted by this legislation. And that became kind of a really big focus area for us. I think also the city associations are starting to realize that they can't just like fold their arms and say no, no, no to everything when it comes to housing legislation, or they're just going to get left out of the conversation. The pressure to address the housing crisis is so strong on state legislators and local legislators. And it's not just in places like Seattle that are traditionally always more expensive. All across our state, in Republican communities and Democratic communities, the number one issue that legislators hear from folks is that housing is too expensive and they can't afford it. And I'm 38. I was 36 when I joined the legislature. And I ran for office largely because people my age who are working parents, working families, people that are starting to take care of their elder parents, I saw how many of us just could not afford to not just live in the communities we choose to live in, but live in any community in this state. And I really became concerned about that. And I wanted to be a stronger voice for people in my age demographic who are really desperate for housing. And those people cross ideological boundaries, economic boundaries. And I think that growing demand from all corners helps also kind of push forward, where it's like, yeah, the Association of Washington Cities, of course they oppose it. They're always going to oppose preemption legislation, but like your local voters want this. Like your city council may be telling you they don't want it because the city council politics are very hot, around zoning issues, but like I have plenty of city council members that come to me and they're like, oh, thank God you guys passed this so that we can finally move forward. And I think that is also part of it, is that the practice of letting housing and land use be purely a city by city decision is part of what has contributed to our current situation with homelessness and with housing inaffordability and housing inaccessibility, because the politics at the city by city level are so difficult when it comes to land use and zoning. It's very hard to make progress. So the options are then we do nothing and we just let the current situation get worse and worse and worse, or we act in a comprehensive statewide way with an ear towards listening to what cities need. You also just can't be like, F the cities, like, I don't care about them, because they are going to implement the legislation. And you need to understand the realities of some of the challenges that they are facing. But you also have to understand that, and I've worked in government at every level, including as a city government staffer. And I know it's just always easier, like, to do it tomorrow, to do it later, to do it next year, to not do it. And so like, it's never the right time to implement transformative legislation that's going to be expensive and time consuming. And so some of it is you have to be willing to kind of push through a little bit and hold tight to your vision, which for us was abundant housing near transit that everyone could access, and creating communities that are beautiful and affordable and allow people to drive less and to live more. And, you know, for us so kind of really holding on to that when you're kind of going through all the different pieces. But yeah, I think with the other thing with the Association of Washington Cities is growing your pool of allies. I mentioned this in one of the Q&As, but like in Washington State, for example, organized labor is a very powerful constituency in the state legislature. And so we got the Washington State Labor Council to support TOD, because this is a bill about creating more housing for working people near where they live and more opportunities for people to own small businesses and other issues. We got Republicans on board by saying, you know, this is about addressing onerous regulation that's preventing building. We struggled to bring the development community on board because of the affordability requirements, even though we did incorporate into the legislation their #1 request, which was for extended MFTE. Unfortunately, after doing that, they decided, I think they started to panic that the bill was actually going to pass. And so they decided to move the goalposts again. But, you know, continuing to keep the table open for them to be a part of it. And if I couldn't get, it's similar to the cities, if I couldn't get the development organizations to play ball, what developers did I know and could I be connected to who could help me understand their business and how it works and give some ground truthing? And that's also where Yonah, you know, your research at the Urban Institute was really helpful in just kind of, that is one of the challenges when you're doing this kind of legislation, is that there are a lot of voices that are telling you like 100% this is going to happen, or 100% that's going to happen. And many of those voices have a financial interest in convincing you that that is going to be the outcome of your decision. And so there's not a lot of, because we're sort of in this new cutting edge territory, there isn't necessarily a ton of data or background or information. So you have to kind of be able to take all the pieces and hold them all in your head, but also stay fixed on where you're trying to go and keep moving even with all the noise.
That was great, Representative Reed.
It was a long answer, sorry.
It was a long answer, but I think you inspired a lot of folks. People are already re-quoting you, drive less, live more. I love it as well. I think that's wonderful. You know, I share your point of view on a lot of these topics, especially related to the need to bring in this diversity of stakeholders like developers. But one of the things that we heard when we were talking to representatives at some of the local level about the Washington State sort of progress on TOD was that in some of the sort of lower income cities, they struggle attracting development projects. So it makes perfect sense to have a state bill that says, we want to have high density in central Seattle, central Bellevue, where there's, a lot of demand to live there. Developers want to come in and build towers or build multifamily apartment buildings. But there are also parts of the region of the Puget Sound, but also parts of Spokane and Vancouver
that have lower demand and that aren't necessarily pulling in development, even if the state changes the law. And so I wonder if you all have any thoughts about, whether there's a role of the state government in thinking about communities that struggle to bring in developers and what that role can look like.
I think I'll take a crack at half of that, and I don't know about the second half of it, but I think one of the things that's of interest when we think about this is kind of like you have the chicken and egg question: does transit come first, or does the density and then transit follows? And I work closely with transit agencies in a whole half of my lobbying capacity, and it's always hard, right? You kind of try and figure out where development might occur. So that's a part of like fixing some of this, is making sure that we have strong transit lines that will help facilitate. You're showing great access where, the likelihood of riding transit goes up if it's more frequent, and you have development capacity, people who can live close to that. And I think that taking into account that transportation is the second biggest cost in everybody's household right now is something that I think is going to continue to drive development. But I think one of the things that this bill does is kind of take away the unequal nature of it. The way Washington works is every local jurisdiction has their own permitting requirements, their own impact fees, they have their own parking requirements, they have all of these things. That means if I build in downtown Seattle, I have to do something completely different if I build even 10 miles south in Federal Way or Burien. And I think one of the things that this bill does is it just kind of creates that flat level playing field. So if I'm building in Seattle, I know I can build in Vancouver the same way, or in Federal Way the same way. There's also some, things that I think local jurisdiction can do to help facilitate that. And I think one thing that is a long-term goal that we're going to have to address is how do we make sure that we kind of have job centers, that are inherent in every city, a little bit, because we know that's a driving force for Seattle, Bellevue, Redmond, Kirkland, and getting closer to those jobs. So that's something we'll have to take care of. But I think one of the things that helps solve this kind of like under demand is that you're not going to take the risk of not knowing your timeline to build or how many parking spots you're going to build in one community. If it's all the same, you kind of know what you can get into, and you're going to be able to apply your ROI in a more consistent manner. At least that's what we're hoping. And one of the things that we've done with middle housing and this is kind of make it a level playing field, so you're not jumping through hoops. And I can't answer the second half of that, which is how do we incentivize that at local levels?
Yeah, I think one thing we tried to do was to not disincentivize it. So like, for example, the city of, it's so interesting we were talking to cities in this bill, because you had like some cities that were like, the affordability mandate must be 80%. And and you had other cities that were like, we can't have affordability mandates because we already struggle to attract development here. And any additional barrier is going to just be further harmful for us. So like in a city like Kent, they were talking to us about how they've already kind of upzoned above the level of the bill, and they are still struggling to attract development. And so that is what inspired the piece of the bill that the affordability requirements only apply to places that are newly upzoned by the bill, or basically places where the state is forcing you to upzone. And so cities like Kent that have already done upzoning, they're not subject to the same affordability requirements, but they have their own kind of unique local context that where they've tried to really increase their zoning requirements. And so it was sort of part of that push and pull of like, how much can we accommodate specific circumstances, and how much do we have like a single statewide standard? Understanding that we're applying this to areas where like, it's not like, this isn't like the Oklahoma land grab. Like people aren't waiting at the starting line to come in and occupy these areas. Like this plan, the comprehensive zoning changes apply to existing neighborhoods, existing cities, places where there are already roads and businesses. And so you do have to be thoughtful about how you can address like existing conditions and as best you can. And it's always a little bit imperfect. I will say, yeah, somebody did ask about like zoning requiring employment centers or community amenities. That was something that was really interesting and challenging, because if you think about it, we we don't really zone for, we do zone for broad use, where we say like commercial, industrial, residential, but when cities like zone and permit, they sort of permit for the size of the building and height and how many rooms it has and stairs and, you know, does it fit the overall use? But cities don't really regulate like you have to have a childcare center here or you have to have a grocery store here. And so there really wasn't like a framework for us to require certain community elements other than to say that like mixed use buildings could be built as well as residential. And I think that's an interesting knot to sort of unpick is like, how do you, ensuring more housing is really important. But how do we also like incentivize better communities within these spaces? And the existing kind of infrastructure for what we can do from like a legal state or even local city perspective is very flimsy in that space. We don't have a lot of tools to require that and nor do I think from a statewide level it would be very feasible to sort of say like every city in the state must look exactly like this. So that's part of it too, is like how do we allow enough flexibility that individual cities can kind of manage their own spaces.
Thank you. Well, I just want to jump in quickly. I'll turn it back to you, Kate, but I do want to jump in quickly to say, I know it's the top of the hour. We are still going to be on here for another 15 minutes for those of you who are able to join, but we totally understand for those of you who have to go back to your normal day. But we will have recordings that are available for download on the website for the next 15 minutes if there are things missing. But with that, let me pass it to Kate.
I just wanted to jump in because we've gotten a couple of questions about the around displacement and what this bill or other policies do around mitigating displacement. So I wanted to open that conversation. I can start it, but I'd love to hear more from Rep. Reed and Bryce as well on that front. So, you know, we had a couple different questions, which is, you know, a common dynamic where adding transit can increase, you know, values of the land in an area. And that means that precisely the people who we would want to benefit from transit, who are, you know, getting new access to it, might end up getting priced out of that community. And so there's a couple of things in this bill. There's kind of complementary policies that are happening with other bills. And then I think Rep. Reed and Bryce, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So obviously the concern around displacement is part of the reason there's an affordability mandate as part of this legislation. And that was a pretty central part to how this bill came together and how it got across the finish line, is because we heard a lot of concern from constituents and legislators that it needed to have some sort of component around affordability. The other piece of the puzzle that we didn't touch on at all yet, but is kind of part of the broader context, is that the other major housing bill that passed in 2025 was an anti-rent gouging bill. And that bill caps rent increases at 10% or 7% plus inflation. It includes an exemption for new construction for the first 12 years. So we felt that that was a balance to kind of continue to encourage development while protecting people who are in current developments. But the rent gouging bill is a really important kind of complementary piece to this housing supply piece of the puzzle. And Futurewise was also, we were not the lead organization on that legislation, but we were a strong voice on it, particularly from kind of the urbanist argument for why we thought that bill was important. There's also, we talked earlier about HB 1220, which sets requirements for how cities do local housing plans. And one of the requirements in 1220 is that cities look at displacement concerns and adopt policies to prevent displacement. So there's kind of a suite of policies, you know, building around the displacement concern. So I wanted to bring those three to the forefront. And Bryce and Rep. Reed, if you have others you want to flag for listeners, it would be helpful to call those out as well.
Yeah, there's also oh, go ahead, Bryce.
No, I'll let you go first.
Oh, I was just going to say there's elements within the TOD bill that that allow for slower implementation in places that the state deems as being at high risk of displacement. And so part of what the TOD bill will do is direct the Department of Commerce to create the first kind of statewide displacement risk map. And in part, we wanted the state to be in charge of that, because I will tell you, there are some cities that I know who have not cared one single red cent about displacement of any community, let alone communities of color. And then the minute we start talking about more density and more housing, suddenly they are like at the front lines with their Black Lives Matter t-shirts on and their signs and you know, you're displacing this community, you're displacing that community. And it doesn't, as a person of color, like it doesn't really have that much to do with us and our communities, and has a lot to do with certain folks in power wanting to keep things a certain way. And so kind of navigating those challenges, again, about like, when are you listening and trying to accommodate displacement? We spent a lot of time on that in this bill. And when are you saying like, okay, you're saying you don't want displacement, but what you're really saying is you don't want housing. And you know, folks that look like me are just a convenient kind of stand and shield for that conversation. So, you know, that's been part of our work as well.
Yeah, and I think the final thing I'll say, and Kate touched on it, is in House Bill 1220, we did require jurisdictions to start addressing displacement. It's kind of a flimsy legal term, which is the best way I can put it. But, you know, when you're starting this work, that's where we got to at that point. But I would say that, you know, Futurewise and many of our partners are reviewing every single comp plan that's being adopted, and we're commenting on processes of anti-displacement. We're working with partners who work deeply in those communities to understand what they need in terms of anti-displacement policies and working to get those passed. You know, I will say that the other half of Kate and Marcella's job often is, and we have other people who organize just around local policies, and we have them commenting based on what we've done at the state. So I think it's a really good question, because what we've hoped, again, is you start building this legislation is, if the jurisdiction has done it right, they kind of have a suite of anti-displacement policies that they can use to apply to this. And as Rep. Reed said, there is specifics that say you can apply to commerce to delay some of them if you're hitting these targets. So I think that there's some there. I also think that, you know, hopefully we continue to get those deep community interests that are there for housing, but also understand the need for community institutions, and making sure we're preserving those, because that's how you're really going to stop a lot of this. But that's a lot of how we're doing it.
I think this is all really helpful from the perspective of understanding this issue of displacement, because it is real. I mean, when we looked at the data and looked at what's happening around the transit stations in a lot of the higher income communities in Washington state, unfortunately, they are becoming places that are increasingly higher income, increasingly white. And, you know, that's a phenomenon that we should be addressing if we want to create integrated, equitable neighborhoods in the communities near transit. So I think this is actually a really important complement to the broader issue of development near housing. I did want to add, though, you know, I think there's some avenues forward for addressing some of these issues that I think I would like to hear from you all about, whether you think they're possible in the Washington state context. So one of them is, you know, in HB 1491, there's actually a provision for supporting municipalities with direct investment in infrastructure around transit. But I know, you know, Rep. Reed, I'm sure this wasn't your choice, but you all didn't get around to actually funding that in the legislature.
Never happens.
And, you know, I think from my perspective, when we talked to local stakeholders, they told us repeatedly, you know, we want to create walkable, landscaped, you know, communities around our transit station, but it's really hard for us to pay for that because we don't have that much tax base and we need state assistance. And from my perspective, that kind of element from the state could be huge. And so I guess I want to hear from you all, you know, why are we not getting that? Is it possible to get that soon? What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we passed this bill during like the worst state budget situation since the Great Recession. So there was not a huge appetite from the budget writers to include a ton of new funding, especially given that the TOD bill, like its official implementation date is at the 5-year comprehensive plan update, which for most cities that are impacted is going to be 2029. And so, or could be sooner. Cities are welcome to implement it sooner. But I think they felt like let's try to address this like when we're a little bit closer to comp plan revisions. We did create the account, so at least there's a place for the money to go. Now the next step is to try to get the money there. And, that is something that I have been talking to cities about and something that we've been trying to think about how we can increase. We also have other kind of state funding mechanisms that cities can tap into, so not just this one. And I think part of the decision was they wanted to preserve funds for some of the existing funding mechanisms, and there weren't a lot of new accounts getting funded. So I think it's a start. There's a lot more that we could do, and I do think that supporting cities is really important. And just to build on your comment, Yonah, about why it's so important about displacement, I'll also say like transit zones are, in my perspective, particularly sensitive to displacement of communities of color because we often build transit on busy roads where we have pushed communities because of other exclusionary land use and zoning practices. And so that's one of the reasons why I was so adamantly committed to the guaranteed affordability elements in this bill. And I know there's a lot more work to do. So
the other aspect I want to add, and I know Rep. Reed works on this because she sits on the transportation committee, and we kind of do it in a backdoor way, but over the last 3 years, we have increased funding for bike lanes and transit and stuff like that within our transportation budget just on its own. It was, we had a new transportation budget that invested in new things. And one of those was, additional support for safe routes to school. And, we have a complete streets mandate for all maintenance projects at the state level. So we're getting money out the door to kind of make that happen. Places like Highway 99 in downtown Seattle, but I just want to be blunt that every single like 4 or 5 lane road that goes through any city that has major transit is probably a state highway or was at one point, and those are going to have to start being rebuilt. So I want to say that yes, we would love to get a big chunk of money out of the capital budget just to do that work. But, I think that there's also things that we've kind of quietly done that will help support it. And again, and I think it's also not to pick on cities, but I have to say it is, there's an allocation of resources on how local jurisdictions want to maintain and design their roadways. And I know that, partners have been working for years to help local jurisdictions redesign their roadways. And we're trying to open up funds for them to do that. Take Sound Transit, for example. They've worked really hard on adding additional infrastructure dollars to make sure that it's safe to get to and from those stations. They haven't always worked perfect, but I think that, we're trying to get there through other policies and other funding. But I think that the next big frontier period in housing affordability is infrastructure, water, sewer, stormwater, sidewalks, bike lanes. That's the thing that we actually have to do to make sure that we're addressing it.
Okay,
And one piece,
go ahead, please.
just really briefly on what Bryce just said, I think, folks on this call, I saw a lot of, planners and city folks, a lot of people who are responsible for implementing this kind of work. And I think, the piece that Bryce just spoke to, it's important from a policy perspective. It's also important for building the political momentum to keep this kind of stuff going, because people you want to live in a vibrant neighborhood, right? They don't want to just live in a tall apartment building on a busy arterial and then there's nothing else around, right? Like you want to build the whole kind of urban infrastructure of what a really great place looks and feels like. And so that's kind of the next piece of the puzzle, which I also saw was one of Jess's questions about what's next. I think Bryce just covered it.
Thank you, Kate. Yes, absolutely agree. You don't want to just live in an isolated tower on an island. Nobody wants that. Okay, we're about to end, and I'm going to give everybody about 20 to 30 seconds to give us your conclusion about where you want to go next. You guys gave us a little preview, but what's one additional thing you're thinking about that you want to move forward with? And I'm going to give my idea first. So I'm really inspired by what's happening in British Columbia, specifically from the perspective of the province and the transit authority there, both taking a direct role in leading public development processes. I'm really excited about their role in leveraging the land that they owned near these transit stations to build really affordable projects from the ground up without having to worry about using zoning and then waiting for developers to come later. So that's something I'm keeping in mind. So let me pass it to Bryce.
Yeah, I think I kind of gave mine away, is that, we have to start, in addition to infrastructure, which I still think is going to be a big thing. And again, that's things like water and sewer and stormwater, and as an environmentalist, making sure we're investing in those to make sure that everybody's healthy. And then the other piece to this is, making sure that we're, again, citing all types of facilities. And for Washington, we call them step housing, which is, shelter, emergency shelter, permanently affordable housing, and other things. So that's going to have to, I think those are the next two things that Futurewise is going to focus on over the next few years.
Kate?
Yeah, I mean, definitely everything Bryce just said, and then kind of calling out what he brought up earlier. A lot of, we've passed the state law, and now there's a lot of implementation that needs to happen on the ground. And so Futurewise is lucky that we have a state advocacy team, but we also have, staff that work at the local level, at the city level. And I think Rep. Reed noted in a question, the TOD bill requirements you don't have to comply until 2029, but there's a lot of cities that are doing zoning updates right now. And so we will definitely be working actively in those places to say, why don't just do it now? Save yourself some
Just
work.
do it now.
Why wait till 2029? You're just gonna
Why
do it
rewrite your plan later?
yeah. So that's what I'm excited about, is seeing what we can get done a little bit earlier and ahead of schedule.
And Rep. Reed, last comment.
Wow, give the politician only 30 seconds, which she will now waste making a joke. Everything that Futurewise just said, I'm excited to work with them on the infrastructure issues, on accountability issues. I'm excited to continue to advocate with my own city, with the city of Seattle, to ensure we have the most abundant comprehensive plan, and a comprehensive plan we can be proud of, instead of one that gets us sued by Futurewise for non-compliance. So I'm excited to continue to lean in and use my voice in that way. I am, as Bryce mentioned, I'm the vice chair of the transportation committee, taken a more leading role on passenger rail service. So I am, speaking of Vancouver, right after this, need to organize some legislators to sign a letter to the parliament about funding improvements to the Vancouver rail station. So more frequent passenger rail service on our Amtrak Cascades line, and hopefully we can have transit-oriented development all across the east and western corridor along train lines someday. So trains, bikes, and some automobiles is what I'm going to be working on.
Okay, thank you so much. So it's been an amazing event, and I want to pass it back to Kammy to give a quick conclusion.
Well, thank you so much. Well, thank you, Yonah, for being such an amazing moderator. I want to thank Representative Reed, Bryce Yadon, and Kate Brunette Kreuzer for just your great remarks. It was wonderful. And I want to thank everyone who has stuck with it and participated in the Q&A and also the chat. It was amazing.